Thank you for yet again giving us your time, Sondra. Looking forward to what's on your heart to share tonight, and we'll have some question and answers a bit later on. But I'll just say a quick prayer. Thank you, Father. Baruch Hashem. Thank you, our Father, for who you are to us, ever revealing who you are to us through things that are going on through the world, but yet through the hearts of many people who acknowledge you and cry out to you and get a response to testify of your greatness. We thank you that even now, as we just all together love the people of Israel and look for their prosperity, we just thank you we can be part of that in these days. Amen.
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 Amen. Okay. So I have to say that since the elections took place at November 1st, we have had constant things happening. And of course, we waited very, intensely with bated breath for the government to actually form, even though it was very clear to us from the beginning it was going to be a right-wing government. It in a way, surprisingly, in a way not surprisingly, took quite some time until the government was actually put together, the coalition agreement signed and presented to the Knesset. So that happened just a couple of weeks ago, and actually I think less than 2 weeks ago. And so what I want to do now is kind of give a bit of an update of what's going on with this government, particularly responding to things that you may have heard yourselves in the media, and giving it a chance to see things from a different perspective than what you, I'm sure, are hearing in the media. So first of all, as soon as the government came together, the name that was on everybody's tongue all over the world when it came to Israel was Ben Gvir, Itamar Ben Gvir. And the way people talked about him, you would think that this was an arch terrorist, a crazy person, and a person whose agenda is to totally turn Israel upside down and change everything that we've ever known. So first of all, let me just tell you a little bit about Itamar Ben Gvir. Itamar Ben Gvir is a young fellow, not as young as he used to be, but he has been a major activist for right-wing causes in Israel since he was a kid. Now, when he was a kid and into his young adulthood, he was affiliated with an organization. Well, first of all, a rabbi that he followed, who was actually assassinated in Brooklyn many, many years ago. His name was Meir Kahane. Meir Kahane was a person who put forth an ideology that was quite extreme in many ways, and in fact called for the complete removal of all Arabs from Israel, an ideology that was both really not acceptable to the vast majority of the country, but also not at all practical. And what he didn't do was make any distinction between Arabs who are good and kind people who would like to be loyal citizens of the state of Israel and Arabs who are terrorists. So initially, Ben Gvir followed that kind of ideology. And in fact, when he was 17 years old, he was arrested for, I don't know exactly what he did, but he was arrested on a charge of violence and racist activity of some kind. Okay? He was 17. He was a minor. Okay? And that is long past him, and anything that happens at that stage, it wasn't anything serious. He didn't kill anybody. He didn't hurt anybody. Okay? He was making disturbances and was putting forth an ideology that was unacceptable. Okay? Since that time, first of all, he's grown. He was very interesting story about him. He's very smart. And at one point, he brought his case before the Supreme Court of Israel on his appeal had to do with the fact that he was being charged unjustly. And he insisted on representing himself. He was a young man. He had absolutely no legal training, but he insisted on representing himself. And he stood before the Supreme Court judges of Israel and he made his case. At which point, then Senior Supreme Court Justice Aaron Barak, who is well known in Israel for being the author of a more left-wing agenda with regard to the judicial system, and we will be discussing that shortly. But anyway, all that to say, the antithesis of Ben-Gvir in terms of ideology, in terms of politics, in terms of everything. He looks at him, this young man, but standing before him, and he was very impressed at his ability to make his own case. And he turned to him and he said, "You need to go to law school. You need to study, become educated to refine your arguments so that you can argue with greater intelligence. You have great potential." Well, he listened. And when he got older, he went to law school and he became a lawyer. And for the last quite number of years, he has been very involved. I mean, he's a lawyer, takes all kinds of cases, but his specialty has been defending people on the right that have either been unjustly charged or charged in a way that is more aggravated, or at least that is the argument that's put forward. Not everybody he defends is innocent. Plenty of people he defends are not innocent, but this was his specialty. And then, of course, he went into politics. Today, you hear all these people, and I've seen articles like this. I've seen, there was an interview not long ago, I believe, on the BBC that someone had sent me and talked about Ben-Gvir as being a convicted criminal. Now, this is, as I said, he was 17 years old when he was charged and long gone, and it's over. And he personally says today, "I no longer have that ideology." He has disavowed any kind of racist or violent ideology that he may have possessed when he was 17, and even some of the more extreme ideology that he may have advocated as recently as 5 or 10 years ago. He has made public statements on many occasions that he is no longer there. And yet, unlike other politicians, when it comes to someone like Ben-Gvir, they're constantly saying he's a convicted racist when he really, really is not. Now, you have a lot of stuff going on today in the media, both in Israel and abroad, that are spreading a lot of fear about what this government is about to do. And one of the things that is coming up over and over again is the fact that it's a homophobic government, that they are going to pass legislation that is anti-homosexual, anti-gays, anti-LGBT. Now, what I will say is that it is a conservative coalition. So you have people in the government who are conservative politically. You also have quite a large number of people in the government who are religious, okay? And for the most part, religious people, both, shall we say, Orthodox Jews and Bible-believing Christians, will share the view that homosexuality is not something that God favors, okay? However, that doesn't mean that we are saying to discriminate against these people in any way, to treat them differently, or to treat them with anything other than the respect due to them as human beings. That doesn't mean we have to agree on things, but that everybody deserves respect, and certainly not any discrimination. So one of the things that people have said, again, about Ben-Gvir is that he's a homophobe, and that he is going to be persecuting and advocating, legislation that will discriminate against LGBT. So at one point, someone asked him, an interviewer asked him, "What would you do if you discovered that your son was a homosexual?" And he answered, "I would hug him. I would love him." Okay. And yet this doesn't, and he's had to repeat that. In fact, just a few days ago, he was again interviewed here in Israel on a news program. And again, he was challenged with being homophobic. And he says, "I want to remind you about this little interview question that was thrown my way and how I answered." And then he reminded us of this exact question and answer. And again, it doesn't matter, though, sometimes what you're going to say. There is, unfortunately, out there a group of people on the left, and they are not the entire left, and they're not even a large number of people in Israel, but they are certain people of Israel that are trying to lump all these things together. Yes, there are legitimate disagreements on a lot of issues between the government of Israel today and large numbers of the population in Israel. But to lump all these issues together and paint it with the most extreme brush is really not fair. So when you read the news and you see these kinds of accusations being, bandied about, this is something that's worth keeping in mind. One final thing that I would like to say about Ben Gvir, and I'm sure this is something that reached your news as well, was his visit to the Temple Mount last week. Now, Itamar Ben Gvir has been going up to the Temple Mount for many, many years, as do many Jews. And the issue of the Temple Mount is a very, very difficult one, and one that Itamar Ben Gvir, as well as I, as well as many people like me, have very definite views about. Initially, when the Temple Mount was liberated in 1967, there was, unfortunately, a decision was taken to hand the control of the Temple Mount, where there are two mosques, back to the Waqf, which is the Islamic Trust. Now, it is my sense that when Moshe Dayan did this, who was then the general, or he was actually the Minister of Defense in the Six-Day War, when he did this, his thought was, this is religious authority. He didn't see it as political authority. And basically what he was doing was saying, don't worry, we are not going to interfere with the way you handle your prayers, your religious meetings, and all that kind of thing. And that's absolutely true. Nobody in Israel wants to go into a mosque and say, this is what you need to do. This needs to be run by the Muslims. However, what developed as that kind of understanding became an understanding was that the Muslims control the whole Temple Mount, not just the religious issues, but everything. It also came to a point where initially they would not allow Jews to go up on the Temple Mount at all. Now, initially that actually met with a great deal of cooperation among many, many sectors in Orthodox Jews. Secular Jews weren't as interested in going on the Temple Mount. It's a very, very holy place. Most of the people who go up to the Temple Mount go up there because of its holiness. They're not going to take a tour, okay? I mean, it's interesting, but they're going up because of the holiness, because of its spiritual significance. So initially, there were great, most of the rabbis at the time believed that we should not go up to the Holy Mount, the Temple Mount, because of its holiness. Now, you well know that the temple, both Solomon's temple and the second temple were on the Temple Mount. And in part of the temple, there are some sections, one of which is the Holy of Holies, where the ark stood. Actually, there was no ark in the second temple, only in the first temple, but there was still a Holy of Holies in the same exact place. Because we believe, in the same way that, and we know this from the Bible, that the only time any human being can go into the Holy of the Holies is one day a week, one day of the year on Yom Kippur, on the Day of Atonement, and it's the high priest. He's the only person who goes in. He has very special rules that he has to do. It's set forth for us in Leviticus, and that's it. It's a very holy place that we don't go into. We don't see. We know it's there. For us, that is the center of God's presence in this universe. And by directing our prayers towards there, we have a sense that we're meeting God in some more special way. Okay? So the rabbis were concerned because in Jewish tradition, that holiness remains forever. Once Solomon built his temple, established the Holy of Holies in that particular place, God's holiness remains there. And therefore, that area, you cannot go to that area at all. Nobody, ever, okay? There's also parts of the temple that you're not allowed to go to unless you are completely purified. Purification means if you've ever come into touch with a dead body, that you have used the red heifer and all the rules of that are also listed in the book of Leviticus and also in the book of Numbers to be purified. And of course, we don't have that either. We don't have a red heifer. We don't have a temple. We don't have this purification method, which means that there's only certain parts of the Temple Mount that would be accessible to Jews who believe in these rules, which is why initially the rabbis it's hard to say this, but in effect, the rabbis and the Arabs had the same view. Jews off the Temple Mount. Now, after a number of years, rabbis start to realize this is very bad for both spiritual and for political reasons. For political reasons, because the Arabs were misreading the rabbis not going up on the Temple Mount, not as being in unbelievable respect for the level of spirituality there, but on the contrary, they read this as being an admission on the rabbis that the Jews don't belong on the Temple Mount, which is exactly the opposite, okay, of how we feel. And so then over time, more and more Jews started studying more about the Temple Mount and seeing where are the places that there's no problem to go, where are the places where you can't go, and etc. And there became a movement of Jews who were going up onto the Temple Mount. And Jews who wanted not just go up and visit, but they wanted to pray. And so the rule became that after a lot of struggle, the Jews are allowed to go up on the Temple Mount, but to this very day, Jews are not allowed to pray on the Temple Mount, okay? Now, Christians are also not allowed to pray on the Temple Mount. Now, what you think of in your heart, nobody can control. But God forbid someone should see you moving your lips in a way that is not looking like conversation, but as prayer. God forbid you should be holding up your hands in ways that are clearly movements of prayer, and you're going to have somebody escort you off the Temple Mount, sometimes kindly and sometimes not so kindly. And it is this issue that Itamar Ben-Gvir has been fighting against for years, way before he was a member of Knesset, certainly before he became a minister. And so one of the questions that everybody raised when he became a minister was, is he going to still go up on the Temple Mount? Now, why did everybody care? Because for some reason, the Arab world sees this idea of Jews going on the Temple Mount as a desecration of their holy site. Now, we live in a country, the land of Israel is holy to 3 different faiths: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And we, the Jews, have always been of the opinion that every person should have free access to their holy sites and everybody else's holy sites, as long as they act with respect and don't do anything to denigrate someone else's faith. Let them come up. And that is how all the holy sites that Israel administers, whether they're churches, whether it is the remains of some ancient Jewish site, whether it's a synagogue, a modern synagogue, whether it's a church, it doesn't matter, or a mosque, okay? Everybody has access. Now, of course, Muslims don't allow non-Muslims into a mosque. It's their right. You could say it's discriminatory. I don't care. I don't need to go into their mosque, okay? But to go on the territory where their mosque is standing, really, that's really a bit much. What Itamar Ben-Gvir, and again, people have said he's racist. He's not racist. What is he advocating? He's advocating the right for every human being to pray on the Temple Mount. Why did he want to go on the Temple Mount last week? Because last week was the 10th of Tevet, one of 4 fast days in the Jewish calendar that have to do with, they commemorate in one way or another some aspect of the destruction of the temple. The 10th of Tevet is a day when the Babylonians first lay siege to the city of Jerusalem, going back to the first temple times. And that day is commemorated as a fast day by Jews all over the world. And so because that was a day that's so closely aligned with the temple, okay, he wanted to go up. And it was very interesting. There was all kinds of disinformation that was put out the day before in order to reduce the kind of conflict that might end up coming from a visit like this. No one knew it was going to happen except the police, the security people that needed to know. And so he went up very early in the morning. He had no press accompaniment. He went up just with security people. He went up, he was there for a few minutes. He did what he wanted to do. And then he came down. It was filmed, of course, and then was released afterwards. After he'd already come off the Temple Mount, it was then released. And of course, all hell broke loose, because you have the Arab world saying, this is a change of the status quo. Now, the status quo is the Jews can go up to the Temple Mount. Ben-Gvir did not pray in any, now, again, he said himself, I'm not going to tell you what I did in my heart, okay? Everybody prays in their heart. God hears your thoughts. You don't have to actually talk out loud for God to hear you. And I'm sure he prayed, But the point was he didn't do anything to offend, quote unquote, the status quo, even as he is one of the biggest advocates of changing the status quo so that everybody should be able to pray. And I heard an interview with him that was absolutely fascinating. He was talking, and this interviewer kept trying to say, but this is causing great unrest, and we could see increased violence and riots, and nobody wants that, and why do you need to do this, and is it really worthwhile? And he said to her, do you know that there is a water fountain there on the Temple Mount, and that Jews are not allowed to drink from the water fountain because the Muslims see that as desecrating the holiness of the site, that Jews are not allowed to drink from a water fountain. And he said that to her, and she didn't have an answer. She didn't know what to say. And it was really a brilliant interview, because I think what he did in that little example of a water fountain is not religious. There's nothing spiritual about a water fountain. It's just a place where people who are thirsty can go have a drink of water. And yet, by turning this into something that even that is an issue of that we are we defile things. We as Jews defile their holy site. Putting it in that context, I think, really helped create an understanding, at least in Israel, that something has to change, that the situation as it is now is not good. But on the other hand, we are not looking for war, and we're not looking for violence, and it definitely has to be done in a way that is, on the one hand, as peaceful as possible, but on the other end, has to be done with determination so that we are not seen as giving in. And one of the reasons, by the way, that even the police and the secret services, etc., supported Ben-Gvir going up to the Temple Mount on that day was because a day or two before, Hamas threatened that if he goes up on the Temple Mount, they will open a terrorism war. And at that point, it was seen, even from a purely defense perspective, if he was not to go up on the Temple Mount, it would be giving in to terrorism, and rather than preventing terrorism, it would exacerbate it. And so that was something that ended up reaching quite a level of a consensus. So that is, I spent a lot of time on Ben-Gvir. I do want to now just go to one other person in the government that is worth looking at, and issues that are coming as a result of it. So that is Yariv Levin. Yariv Levin was recently appointed as the Minister of Justice, and he's immediately announced that he is going to be put forward a complete, comprehensive reform of the judicial system. Now, this is a reform that he and many others like him have been advocating for a very long time. And the problem is as follows. The main problem is as follows. The system by which judges are appointed in the state of Israel was initially a system that was set out to avoid the political system. I know there are countries, the United States, for example, all state judges are elected in a popular election, and federal judges are appointed, but they have to be approved by the Senate. So if you look at this idea of the many countries look at the idea of judges being up for election as a cheapening of the judicial system, because depending on which political party has the more upper hand and what issue is more popular at that point, that's the judge who will be elected, and not necessarily a judge who has the best legal knowledge or is highly respected in the judicial system, in the profession. So Israel has always been a country where the judges were appointed by a committee that is heavily made up of representatives of the legal community, representatives of the Bar Association, representatives of judges themselves, and these are the people, and a few politicians, okay? But the weight was in the hands of the judges. What began to happen over the years, and what more and more people began to point out, is the judges, especially the Supreme Court, had a definite left-wing bias, And one of the things that was perpetuating that left-wing bias was the fact that it was the judges themselves that had the overwhelming voice in choosing new judges. So if you started out with a group of judges who were left-wing, they were going to approve judges that were left-wing, and they were not going to approve judges that were right-wing. And this came to a head some years ago when there was a very, very highly respected judge, a professor of law, and widely believed to be Supreme Court material. And this same Aaron Barak that we spoke about earlier, this very highly regarded Supreme Court judge, who was the one who told Itamar Ben-Gvir to go to law school, he blocked her appointment. And it was very widely believed that because she didn't agree with his ideologies. Now, we're talking about ideologies. We're not necessarily talking only about left or right. We're talking about judicial ideologies. So, for example, it was Barak who initiated a complete judicial revolution in many ways. Until he came along, the Supreme Court never saw it in its jurisdiction. And there's absolutely no law that gives the Supreme Court the jurisdiction to overturn a law of the Knesset. And it was Barak that decided that, yes, the Supreme Court has that right. And ever since he has had this, he has been he initiated what they call an activist court, which means the court feels free to review all legislation and knock down parts of the legislation or whole laws that they believe are not consistent with what they believe would be protection of civil rights or other issues. Now, where does this become a political issue? So, for example, the country of Israel is a Jewish and democratic state. What does that mean? On the one hand, Judaism is the official religion. It's the official peoplehood. It is the one and only Jewish state. So at the most basic level, that means that all Jewish holidays are legal holidays, for example. But it's also a democratic state, which means that if a Muslim or a Christian has a holiday, they are also able to take off time for their holiday. Every Christian can take off Christmas, and every Muslim can take off the Eid al-Fitr and some of these other holidays, but those are not official legal holidays of the state. It's not part of the, let's say, overall culture of the state. So that's an easy example of what it means to be Jewish and democratic. Democratic also means that every single citizen, regardless of their faith or ethnic background, has an equal voice, and they vote and they have a say. They vote, they can be voted in, and they have a say in how the country is run. On the other hand, we have a law called the law of return. The law of return means that if you are Jewish, you can come to Israel and immediately be granted citizenship. If you are not Jewish, you don't have that right. So some people would say that's not democratic. You should have equal right for every citizen on this earth to come and be a citizen of Israel. On the other hand, Israel has always said, and around this law there is very much consensus, that it is a Jewish country. And if you want to maintain it as a Jewish country, you have to give preference to Jews who want to come to Israel other than other people, because if everybody can come, eventually you're not going to have a Jewish country. You're going to have a country like every other country, and its Jewish character will be lost. There are many, many times when these issues are coming to some sort of head. And the question then becomes, what is the most important value? You've got two values, they're both very important. What happens when these values tend to conflict? And this is where the politics comes in. Because if you have a Supreme Court that believes that the democratic value always supersedes the Jewish value, then they will shoot down legislation that they see is violating civil rights. Now, one of the most classic examples of that, and one of the ones that really made people very, very angry in recent years, was a law that was passed many times by the Knesset and every time shot down by the Supreme Court, was a law having to do with immigration. Okay? Illegal immigration. You have people coming in. I mean, this was reduced a bit in recent years after Netanyahu built a wall, a fence, actually, along the border with Egypt, okay? But before there was a fence especially, any refugee from Africa who didn't like what was going on in his country walked across the Sinai Desert and walked into Israel. as an illegal refugee. Some of these people were really kind and decent people who really had a very hard time and could satisfy the requirements of being a refugee. But most of them are not. Most of them just are looking for a better opportunity. Israel has a better opportunity, and it includes within these people, especially men who have been violent, who have been rapists. Some of them have lived in very large concentrations in the southern parts of Tel Aviv, and they're literally harassing the families who live there. It is a completely different culture. And so Israel saw this as a huge challenge. And how do we change it? And they passed a law. They passed a law that enabled them to take these refugees and send them, if they are recognized as refugees under the International Commission of Human Rights. No, then they are not sent anywhere. The people who are not recognized as refugees under that criteria get the ability to send them out of the country, either back to where they came from or just
Sondra, we can't hear you. We can't hear you, Sondra, because somebody's talking over you.
No, is someone talking? Can you hear me now?
We can now, but we couldn't then because somebody was talking. They'd got their mic on.
I'm sorry if everybody
That's
can
okay.
turn off their
Yeah.
mics. Okay, the people I see are muted. Okay, anyway, so what happened was the Knesset passed a law to enable the police or whoever to get rid of these illegal immigrants. And the Supreme Court knocked down that law, saying that it is a violation of the human rights of those illegal immigrants. Now, the argument in favor of this law is we are a Jewish country. Having a Jewish country is a value, and we cannot turn Israel into a place that everybody could just walk into. I remember Netanyahu once saying Israel is the only democratic country walking distance from Africa. He says we can't solve the problems of Africa, but we have a responsibility to ensure that our country remains Jewish. So we have individuals who are refugees, who have a particular difficult situation. Of course, there's always going to be people that you will absorb out of humanitarian reasons to help them out. But you have to maintain a balance. And you can't just say anybody can come in, and if they figure they were in, you can't send them back. And this was a classic example of where the Jewish nature of the state and the importance of preserving that Jewish nature of the state and its, demographics, etc., comes into conflict with what is perceived as civil rights. And the Supreme Court over and over again voted on the side of the civil rights. And so there are people in Israel saying, but this doesn't represent the balance of these two values that reflect the overwhelming consensus in the country itself. As a result of all of this conflict, this man, Yariv Levin, who has been a very popular and effective member of Knesset for many years from the Likud, has already put together this proposal for a long time. And he finally was, and for many years, it was Netanyahu who blocked it because he felt that there were parts of it that he was hesitant about. He didn't want to, he had tremendous respect for the Supreme Court, and he was afraid of clipping its wings, which I understand. You don't want to be in a position of clipping the wings of your Supreme Court, because there are times when your Supreme Court is critical, really, to preserve the rights of the minorities, of the people who deserve the protection of the court. So it is a very, very delicate balance. But now he put forth this proposal with Netanyahu's support. And one of the things that, when asked why the Likud, all these years being in power, never put forward this proposal before, the answer that the Likud has given is because there was always somebody in their coalition who was against it. I'm not, there were people who were against it. I'm not sure what the political issues were, but today there isn't any member of the coalition who's against this reform, and so it is being put forth, and this has sparked enormous controversy. Part of the reasons, and this is one of the things that disturbs me greatly, I have a legal background, and I really do see that the Supreme Court has overstepped its bounds. I remember studying law in the United States, very similar to in Israel. You have the ability to appeal to the Supreme Court, let's say to complain about the way a government body, the police, somebody has affected you, has persecuted you, has treated you. That exists in the same way in the United States as it does in Israel, and I believe in all Commonwealth countries as well. But there was always a limitation. Who could bring the suit, under what condition? Also, in the United States, for example, the Supreme Court is severely limited and cannot make any decisions that are considered political questions. Here in Israel, those limitations don't exist. So when Aaron Barak put forward his judicial activist revolution, he also swept away all this idea of limiting the jurisdiction of the court only to those cases where the person bringing the case is the one who is actually being heard, that it is not a political question. And so what has happened is, in many cases, the Supreme Court has weighed in and taken decisions that really belong in the Knesset. A political question, a question of values, these kinds of things belong in the Knesset. Why? The Knesset, being the parliament, represents the spectrum of values. We all are human beings and we all have values, but sometimes values clash. How do you determine which value precedes the other, so long as both are within the law? We're not talking about breaking a law. So long as both are within the law, well, majority. And it's very important that the majority of the country are able to determine what are the values that are most important for the country. And so what has happened, that the Supreme Court is being seen as not representing the majority consensus on values in the country. And this is what this reform is all about. Unfortunately, some of the opponents of this reform are spreading, real fearmongers, are spreading a lot of very scary things. And they're saying, oh, they just want to put in a theocracy. Nobody wants to put in a theocracy. They want to have all these things be illegal. That's not the case. Okay. And another thing, another charge that's being put forward is that the only reason this legislation is now being proposed is because Netanyahu is facing charges. He's standing trial for a number of criminal things. And if they can manipulate the court, then ultimately the people who will sit on the Supreme Court or on any of the courts when Netanyahu's appeals, assuming he is found guilty, and then he appeals, and the people sitting on the court at the point at which he appeals will be people that owe their appointment to the Likud politicians. It's definitely something to take into account. On the other hand, I have to say, the Yariv Levin's proposal dates to way before anybody was even investigating charges against Netanyahu, let alone having brought charges. What all this brings before us, though, is that, the number of people recently have been quoting, I think it was Winston Churchill who said this, that the democracy is a horrible system, but it's better than any of the other ones we've tried until now. And I think that's something that we have to recognize. No matter what system we choose, if we're going to give more weight to the Supreme Court, the judicial, the lawyers, et cetera, who are not democratically elected and may tend to be, let's say, left-wing, or if we give more weight to the democratically elected Knesset, no matter how we balance that, there is going to be a problem. And I would say even further, one of the things that people are saying now to Yariv Levin, so if he is not, one of the things he wants to do is change two basic things. One, as I said, change who are the people on the committee that chooses the judges, so there are fewer legal representatives and more politicians, so that the politicians have a built-in majority. That will work very well for now when they're trying to put right-wing people on the court. But what happens if in a few years the Knesset changes and it's a majority of left-wing? That will give those people more of a balance to put more left-wing people on the court. So are you going to say then, oh, that's no good? Or are you going to still say, no, it's the Knesset should govern things? And that kind of argument goes both ways. You can say that argument to the people who are against the reform. You can say that argument to the people who are in favor of the reform. One of the things that I find is extremely disturbing today is how there's so much animosity, so much tension. And in a way, it's very ironic. when this last government was in power, the one that was in power for a year and a half, headed initially by Bennett, then afterwards by Lapid, that was a government that was mostly left-wing, but also a lot of center and right-wing people in the government. And what probably joined these people together more than anything else was the fact that they didn't want Netanyahu to be prime minister. Now, some of the people in that government, some of the parties in that government, and I would point particularly to Gideon Sa'ar, who was once in the Likud and then went to his own party, and now he's part of Gantz's party, was one of the biggest advocates for judicial reform along the same lines as what is being proposed now. And in fact, one of his criticisms against Netanyahu was that Netanyahu didn't do enough to put forward the judicial reform, okay? Today, he is part of a party that is fighting against the judicial reform. Now, I must say, with all honesty, that party, Gantz's party, is not saying as much, I'm against judicial reform. He's saying we need to have a conversation. You can't just impose this without having a conversation. And the Likud people are saying to Gantz, no problem. All of this is going to go to committee in the Knesset, and that means you have lengthy hearings, and all kinds of public figures and experts are invited and welcome to come and present their arguments before the Knesset. And Gantz is saying that's not good enough. Okay, but it is a very important venue for airing the discussion, letting everybody, discuss it. And there's no question that some of the elements in Yariv Levin's current plan will be modified to encompass, some of the objections that will be raised, although the overall goal will be very similar. So that, this is part of what's going on. But beyond that, we have some of these members of Knesset, particularly Lapid, who are putting forward such venom, who are saying we have to take to the streets, we have to fight this, we have to, do whatever it takes, this is terrible, and are saying such terrible things. They're saying Netanyahu is killing democracy, our democracy is threatened. Well, that's garbage. Our democracy is not threatened. But I will say that when Lapid was a prime minister and when Bennett was a prime minister, the Likud and their people in the opposition said the very same thing. Our democracy is threatened. You are destroying the country. And at that time, Lapid and Bennett, well, Bennett's not in politics anymore, but Lapid said, along with all of his people, he said, you can have a conversation, you can disagree with us, but let's do it like gentlemen. Let's have a conversation. Now, when the shoe's on the other foot, he is putting forward the same venom and the same disgusting language and way of talking about the government as he criticized when he was in government and the opposition. And I, as a regular citizen, I have very definite views. I am definitely right-wing. I'm definitely conservative. I understand some of the concerns, and there's so many ways that through conversation, these concerns can be met and understood, and people can put forth arguments. But why does it have to be in this kind of atmosphere where everybody's attacking everyone? And unfortunately, that is what the political environment has become. It is not the environment in the country. If I sit down and talk to somebody who doesn't agree with me, we can have a normal conversation. Even we can yell and scream if we have different points of view, but it will not affect our relationships, and we'll have the ability to converse and reach normal compromises. Why the politicians feel it's a good thing to poison the atmosphere with this kind of horrible rhetoric, beyond me. And this is something that I hope and pray, and I hope you'll join me in this prayer, that they will learn how to converse with respect, that they will give this government, give them its 100 days of grace. Let them first put forward things and see what happens and see if it really is as terrible as they say it's going to be. And, let us take it from there. So that's basically a bit of a roundup on the politics. I just want very, very briefly to give you just a word from the Bible and a little something about a community, and then we'll open this up for Q&A. So first of all, this past week, we read in the Torah portion the final verses of the book of Genesis. And one of the things that always strikes me every time I read it, when they talk about the burial of Jacob, when he requests from his sons that they not bury him in Egypt, but take him to Israel, and also when they actually talk about the burial itself, They don't just say, okay, and Jacob said, please, don't bury me in Egypt, take me to Hebron and bury me there. Or even to say that bury me in the family tomb in Hebron. But in both places, it repeats the whole story of the purchase of the Machpelah cave by Abraham, which is already, it's not relevant. What do we need the information for? It's almost as if the Bible is taking this hammer and banging it in our head. Don't forget what Hebron means. And, when I read this and I said, well, what does that mean? I mean, the fact that it was Abraham's first purchase. It was Abraham's first taking possession of something in the land of Israel when he purchased that tomb. And he created a permanent presence, because when he comes to the Hittites to buy, they said, well, you don't have to buy a tomb. You can just use one of our tombs. And Abraham then describes himself as a resident alien, as somebody who's, kind of not a member, not a real native of the land. And what Abraham is doing there is buying the land in order to, at least in that one symbolic way, say, with regard to this piece of land, I am no longer a resident alien. I'm already setting down roots, which of course we believe is him setting down roots that move forward, that set down the basis and the foundation of the fact that this is our land because God promised it to Abraham. And Abraham takes that first step to ensure that symbolically, if nothing else, he lays claim to Hebron, and Hebron is where it all begins. And so I always say, we always have to remember Hebron. Hebron represents everything. Hebron represents the center of biblical Israel. Hebron represents the very first, laying the claim to the land of Israel, starting with Abraham to our very day. And so when I look at that verse and I see, I have to smile and I have to say what it really says. It says, remember Hebron. And I would just take that as a segue into a community that I've mentioned in the past. I'll mention it again. It's called Avigail. For me, Avigail just represents so many communities of its nature. They talk a lot about illegal outposts. And these are pioneering communities that were established over the last 20 years, various levels of development. One of the things that all of them are that bind all of them together very similar is the fact that they have not yet received official legal approval, and therefore so many of the things that other places take for granted, proper electricity, proper water, these are things that are done in a very unofficial way, cost a lot of money, all kinds of other issues, budgets for security and all kinds of things. It is much, much more difficult. And the only reason that these communities were never given a legal final approval was because of fear of international pressure, primarily from the United States and from other countries. There were prime ministers including Netanyahu, who promised we will not set up new communities in Judea and Samaria. We will only expand existing ones. And to actually set up new ones, they're afraid. They're afraid to do this. Well, one of the things that have come into the coalition agreement that we're very excited about is an agreement that all of those currently existing communities who have not yet received final legal permission, will receive final legal permission. And in fact, Smotrich, who is the head of the Religious Zionist Party, was given the authority within his ministerial portfolio to oversee this kind of thing, together with overseeing the management of Area C, the land within Judea and Samaria that is under complete Israeli control, which also will give him the ability to control, hopefully he'll do it effectively, control illegal Arab building, which is becoming a real problem in Judea and Samaria. So when I think of those things, I think of Avigail, which is located just south of Hebron in what we call the Hebron Hills. And I remember the message coming out of our Torah portion of this past week, remember Hebron. For me, remember Hebron means so much, but it also means remember all those Jews who have come back to Israel, following the example of Abraham, who purchased that cave in Hebron, who are remembering Hebron and settling the land. And so I just want to end with a hope and a prayer that not only with this government and all the politicians learn to speak decently to one another, but that the current government will indeed be able to accomplish all that it has promised, certainly in sustaining and strengthening Jewish settlement in Judea and Samaria. So that is, I talked a very long time. I know I have that tendency. Don't give me a mic, it's dangerous. But this is opportunity to open up for questions. I'd love to hear from you.
Sondra
well-
Mark, oh, sorry, Sondra Marks speaking. I don't, excuse me. I'd like to know your opinion about the recent vote of the UN General Assembly and some sort of referral to the International Court of Justice. And does this court have any jurisdiction?
No, Israel is not a member of, has never signed on. It is not a member of the International Court of Justice, so they have no jurisdiction over us. But it's certainly a problem from a PR point of view. And what Israel is now considering, this, by the way, there's enormous consensus in all of this, that people on right and on the left, except for maybe the extreme left, agree that this is terrible for Israel and have stood very firmly against it. We will not cooperate with it. And what we do, this is all being fueled by the Palestinian Authority and the Palestinians. And so the focus today is a number of measures that will limit the things having to do with the Palestinian Authority as a way of, responding to them, saying, this is how you want to treat us. Well, this is how we're going to treat you. But frankly, I think it's the kind of thing we just have to say like this. Forget it. We don't care.
That doesn't look pretty. Not on you. I was just thinking a few years back, I went to the federal parliament here and I took a lot of, what I'm trying to say is I really just wanted to stand and walk out. They were behaving like naughty children. I couldn't believe their behavior. I'm not telling, that I'm perfect, but to be confronted with men who really have a great responsibility towards so many other people, and the way they were handling things on that floor was just horrible. But I was just thinking now, Sondra, that probably all parliamentarians across the nations really can be a little bit expressive and in ways that really we would think was, not really appropriate. But when you think of the extra pressures on Israel, from all the nations, really, and enemies on your every border, even though they come to the party, shake hands and act nice, if I can put it like that, I think what I sense is they must feel that pressure, even though they try not to, But so if anyone has grace, it's the parliament, I would say, of Israel. There is no ultimate solutions, even though they're trying hard to find them. And I guess we would all agree that we would just hopefully pray for a lot more guidance by God, by each of us, and walking according to what he has given us in the Torah and the scriptures. And yet he will ultimately still continue to bring you together as a people, and he will conclude what he's already said he would do. So I just thought I'd throw that in. The other thing is, just quickly, and then someone else might have, is that I've always had the understanding, Sondra, that there's only one mosque on the mountain, on the Temple Mount, because the dome is not a mosque.
Right, that's right, exactly. It's one mosque and the Dome of the Rock, which isn't a mosque, but it is a Muslim holy place. So
it's a memorial to Muhammad. But the other thing was, because having, as I've been up so many times, and in the beginning, we saw a great shift. No Jews coming up to one, to a bit more. And then I returned about 4 years back, and the Eastern Gate had a prayer room in it, which we figured that was they'd never done that before. But there's things that they're very nervous about, but I just think Israel, and I really think it's great that this Ben Zvi is stirring things. Yeah, up a bit. A very big Joshua in a way.
Yes, he really is. I must say, sometimes his style, is a bit too provocative for me, because I look at him and I say, oh, get over it. It's like a little bit adolescent. Okay. Yeah, but when it comes down to it, and when he's taking responsibility and he's talking, he's I think doing the right thing. I really do.
Yeah, yeah.
Anyway, I see John,
Any
you
more
had something you wanted to say.
Me?
Yeah.
I was going to say I welcome this government because I think it's going back to where Israel was strong, standing up for itself. And I think in terms of democracy, Israel needs to draw that sense of democracy from its biblical roots. Yeah, so Israel is for the Jews first and foremost, and anything that threatens the stability of Israel has to be put to one side, has to be. As regards male politicians, I think it was Margaret Thatcher who said, if you want something said, find a man. If you want something doing, find a woman. And I agree. I think men, I don't know what it is about my sex, but we bluster, we like to have the stage, but we don't do a lot. We strut about and shout our mouths off. So.
Oh, that's great. I think that's really funny. I do want to be very clear from my, I try to present analysis and show how different people see things, but I want to be very clear that I am very optimistic about this government. I have issues. The only issues I have about this government is the extent to which the ultra-Orthodox have influence on issues that I think are not good for the country. But that really is a situation that doesn't affect the international community or anything. That's quite an internal issue, because they're not quite as open-minded on religious issues that I would like. And I think that creates religious tensions within the country that are not necessary. But everything else having to do with this government, I'm very optimistic. And let's just hope and pray that they're able to accomplish what it is that they set out to do.
Anyone else out there
Katrina,
with a question? Katrina.
I see.
you're muted.
Yeah, unmute your, yeah.
Sondra, it's Graham Smith from Australia. Canberra.
Okay. Hi.
Hi. Sondra, you've been into great detail about the manoeuvrings of the Israeli government. Do you see, or can you deduce from these observations that the time is getting closer when Israel will get all their land back?
Well, the way I look at it is our focus now needs to be on making sure we can express our control of land that we already have. That's the bigger question, because we do have a great deal of land. We have, for example, Judea and Samaria. We liberated the whole thing in '67, and then unfortunately gave pieces of it to the Palestinian Authority to control. Okay, but we left Area C in Israel's hands. So Area C still represents the majority of the land in Judea and Samaria. But the amount of Jewish settlement within Area C is so minuscule. And one of the things that I referred to earlier, the fact that Arabs are building illegally all over Area C, which is completely against not only Israeli law, it's against the international agreements that the Palestinian Authority themselves signed with Israel. So that is something that we can just get to a point where we are standing on our legal rights and taking advantage of the area we do have to develop it for Jewish settlement. That already will be a huge step. But before we do that, we have to do that before we think about expanding anything else. We're certainly not looking to start wars to expand our territory. We never have. I do believe that God will find a way to make things happen, but God's not going to make things happen if we don't first do what is in our hands to do. God needs to see that we want this, and then I believe he will find a way to bring the rest along.
Thank you, Sondra, but I gather from your answer that you don't really see any positive signs yet of the expansion of the territory for Israel at the present moment.
No, I don't think that's really what anyone is looking at right now.
Yeah.
when Messiah
Many thanks for your answer, Sondra. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'd like to see Judea and Samaria cleansed of all but Jews, but then
Of all
I'm
the what?
prejudiced. Cleansed of everything but the Jews, but then I'm prejudiced.
We all
Okay,
agree.
right.
Is this
Okay.
Katrina that you were speaking to? It's actually putting her hand up again.
Katrina, I see, wanted to
Yeah,
speak.
Katerina's my wife.
Katrina.
I'm Gordon. I'm her husband. And I
Oh.
just like to
Oh,
congratulate.
hi. Right now I see you.
Great. And thank you very much for the talk. You're just an inspiration in the modern world, because you're doing what Joshua said, to settle the land, not
Mhm.
just be there. But I think I agree very much with the ultra-Orthodox who want to control everything. And I'm not sure that that's would be the best. And thank you for that. But especially, I mean, we've had Biden say that, basically saying, like you're his lapdog, look, you keep the thing. I'm telling you that. I mean, God outranks Biden in my view. Israel just has to stand up and saying, we're God's people. This is right. And the Temple Mount, I mean, he said that Jerusalem is the apple of his eye. And that's got to mean that he looks after his people there if they want to worship.
Yes. Well, we have to work hard, though, and that's one of the disagreements I have with the ultra-Orthodox. I think to bring people, especially within the Jewish people, to a greater understanding of God's vision and a biblical mission, you have to do that with kindness and understanding and conversation, not through force and imposition. And this is one of those issues that I was saying when we are concerned about the ultra-Orthodox influence. I believe it steps away from our ultimate goal, because they're very much into imposition and into other things that do a lot of damage. But
Yeah, I'm
that's
really
our
with you
internal
on that.
battles.
Yeah,
Mm.
thank you. Thank you for that, Sondra.
You're welcome, Gordon.
One of the ladies just said she was leaving, and sorry she wasn't seen, but her camera wasn't working. So for everyone else who's not
Bill
got their
Hannah.
video,
Bill Hannah was
maybe
going to say something.
Sondra, Bill Hanna
Yeah.
from us. The world's leaders all talk about a two-state solution, but I can't see ever being a two-state solution. What do you think about that?
Oh, no, never.
Never.
And I have to say that whereas the opposition to a two-state solution was solidly in the right from the beginning, what's happened today is there's an overwhelming majority of Israelis who are against it as well, just for practical reasons, because all of the territorial compromises that we've made in the last decades have all produced greater Palestinian violence as opposed to less. So really, I personally think this the idea of a two-state solution is a complete dead letter. And,
Yes.
I don't understand why people keep pushing it, around the world. It's
Stupidity
stupid.
knows no
And
bounds.
it's just,
Really.
I think that it's not going to happen. I'm fairly confident of that.
No.
It
I'm
is
glad to
not.
hear that. Glad to hear that. It seems impossible to be any good.
Yeah.
Trump's solution didn't work at all. It would have left Israel completely indefensible.
Well, I think Trump's plan, I thought, had a lot of good things to it, and there was a lot of open things in it. So it depended on where it was going to go, but it never really took off.
Yes.
So, and I think there was a real reversal right after it was announced. Then all of a sudden we had the Abraham Accords, and in exchange for the Abraham Accords, Netanyahu had agreed to freeze this idea of expanding jurisdiction and annexing, or at least parts of Judea and Samaria. That was a great disappointment for us all. And what's come out recently, one of the statements that was made by the United Arab Emirates after Ben Gvir went up to the Temple Mount was that they're very concerned about this idea of sovereignty, because they believe Netanyahu said he was not going to freeze it temporarily, but was going to abandon the whole idea of extending sovereignty in Judea and Samaria. So I'm not sure who said what and what was said at the time, but I can't imagine that Netanyahu would have agreed to permanently abandoning the idea of extending sovereignty. So, I don't feel like we have to have a conversation with the Arab world about extending sovereignty in Judea and Samaria. That's just something we either do or don't do, but we have a lot of stuff to do before then. And there's also one of the things that this government seems to be advocating is through legislation, effectively enabling the communities in Judea and Samaria to operate as if they had been officially part of sovereign Israel. And that's a wonderful first step.
Absolutely.
So,
Yes.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Well, I guess it's any more. Sorry, Rex, have you got a question? Go ahead.
Biden is bumpers and all the people
We'll wind
behind
up after you, Rex.
Sorry? Yeah, Biden's
Did you have
bonkers
a
and all
question?
those behind him are just they're too stupid to know which way is up. I wish they would leave Israel alone, shut up and get out of the road. The problem is, until America gets out of the road, the United Nations kowtowing to them, it just makes me sick to my stomach, really does.
I don't think the problem is America's kowtowing to the United Nations. I think the problem is the United Nations is dominated by factions hostile to Israel.
Gentlemen, you're sounding like a federal parliament now. Okay.
Sorry, what was that?
I was just saying we can understand more clearly how they
Marion, I also think the issue is that the media constantly talk about the West Bank and Gaza as being quote unquote the Palestinian territories, about being Palestinian land. So the world is already calling this Palestinian land, and I think that needs to be addressed.
Well, it's a word we're not supposed to use on this Zoom. Thanks, Mark. Yes. We
Sorry, I
refrain
wasn't
from
aware of that.
And then there's many more. But anyway, much things to be said. It's one of our favourite topics, of course. That's why we're all here together tonight with Sondra. And Sondra, you have our most respect and honour of who you are. I pinch myself to know that I know you and that you've been in my life and that you're just a woman. Well, if you were, I guess you'd be a Joshua, really, in the way you go ahead and you follow the road and you don't get deterred. You just keep going and going. And we thank you for your time to spend sharing with us all your insights. I guess by the time, what's tonight? It's the 10th of February. Shmuel won't have just arrived in Australia. I think he arrives about the 20th of February.
That's right.
So I do hope everyone is having Shmuel's visit on your radar. We've had him on Zoom. He is a most delightful young man. I say young because everyone's young to me, but I think if you can get to hear him, Sondra has been very blessed, and he has been blessed with Sondra, but yet she has really seen that he's come along to be of great value for Christian Israel, and he does carry who he is. He's not a clone of Sondra, but we're quite happy to just have Sondra as herself. And so he's very passionate. He's, as we call a Sabra, which is somebody born there. Doesn't make them any more passionate, but that's how it is. So if you know of a meeting close to you, and please let us know if you're not on our list. I think if you can get in touch with Sondra and get on the mailing list so you will get all the details of where he'll be speaking when he's here in Australia. I think, did you ever go, you didn't go to Tasmania at all, did you?
No, this is
Sondra?
going to be the first, right? Shmuel's going.
So Shmuel's going down to our Apple Isle for the first time, so that's really nice. Yeah. So again, Sondra, thank you for taking the time. And I can only just add my personal little bit here. Try not to get too overcome by the way they're behaving. It's just you know, sit back, put Brahms on or Handel or somebody, you know, just chill out a little. It's just too much these days to get right in the midst of it and never come away.
100%.
So thanks again. And thanks for everyone coming tonight.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed that film. And we have lots more film content and emails and articles that I'm sure you will enjoy as well. Check out our website at cfoic.com and subscribe to our newsletter. You can do that right from the homepage. I know you will really enjoy the content that will land in your inbox on a regular basis. Hope to see you soon.